You've been welcomed multiple times to Canada, but let me add one more. Welcome to Toronto.
Thank you. Thank you.
When your book was published last fall, you wrote the following words: by no meaningful index are Americans today among the freest people in the world. That was before Donald Trump became president, and it was before he declared Liberation Day. How would you describe the state of freedom in the land of the free today?
Okay. First of all, thanks for the kind introductions. I'm really pleased that we're going to have the chance to talk about this and have a dialogue. I mean, to be clear about that, I first have to say something about what I mean by freedom, because Americans immediately begin talking about freedom, and we generally mean nothing by it, or we mean something that I think that it doesn't actually make sense. So my notion of freedom is a positive one, that freedom is about flourishing, developing, becoming the kind of person that you want to be, that freedom is about affirming values in the world in the sense of believing in them, affirming them to yourself, but also affirming them in the sense of making them real in the world. So freedom is a state in which we can make our own choices about what is good and have some amount of power to realize those things. And then freedom is also positive in the sense that to become free in that way, we need other people's help. You can't become free on your own. The things that help us to become free people are legion and complex and require cooperation and generational cooperation. So in the passage that you cited from the book, or the thing that I said, the irony is that the Freedom House judges freedom in a pretty narrow way. It judges it in a very American way, political freedoms, civic freedoms. It's not about the welfare state or the quality of roads or anything, or health insurance or things that I also think count towards freedom. And nevertheless, we scored about 50. And the reason for that, in my view, is that if you want to get to negative freedom, our view of just the government staying away and people having dignity, you have to have positive freedom first, rather than the other way around. And that's the thing that Americans basically tend to get wrong. So sorry I had to do that long prelude.
That's okay, that was my second question, so you've answered it. That's great.
Yeah. Now we're going to do the odd numbered questions from here on out. So
how would you characterize the state of, now that you've defined freedom?
Well, I mean, coming from that, the people who are in charge in the US now, Musk and Trump, are heroes of negative freedom. They are people who tell you that freedom is about being against things. And it starts by being against the government. And this is a trap, of course, because if you think freedom is being you against the government, then you help make the government smaller, and then the government becomes so small it's dysfunctional, and then the government can't do the basic things it needs to do to allow you to have a free life. Like, for example, make sure there's no pollution in the water, or make sure that there aren't measles outbreaks, the kinds of things that are now starting to happen in the United States. So there is actually an intellectual mistake at the beginning of Musk and Trump. Like, the reason why Musk can say this is about efficiency, and Americans for the first 6 or 7 weeks nod their heads and say, oh yes, this might be about efficiency, is that we deeply believe that freedom is about making government smaller. And so if somebody comes and says, I'm going to make government smaller, we think, oh yes, that's probably acceptable in its own right. Whereas in fact, if you make government smaller so that it's dysfunctional, then the oligarchs remain, right? It's like you drain, you have a beautiful, you have a beautiful, you start down an analogy and then you just have to keep going. So watch this. You have a beautiful swimming pool, but there are ugly, dark children's toys on the bottom of it that fell down there years and years ago. But then you drain the swimming pool and you see that they're the ugly, dark. Anyway, that's no. The ugly, dark children's swimming toys are the oligarchs in this analogy, and they're there, right? But the swimming pool, there's a swimming pool, right? There's something nice around them. But if you get rid of the government, the oligarchs are still there, and they're relatively much more powerful than they were before. And that's where we're going, right? So we have these, and Trump is a hero of negative freedom too. Like he says, like, you don't need government, but then he uses government to oppress you, or uses government to oppress other countries, and we go for it. So obviously we're much less free. I mean, the universities are under attack. They're staging these spectacular kidnappings of people on the street to terrify the rest of us. They're sending people to a foreign gulag on the basis of tattoos that they have, including autism awareness tattoos or I love my mother tattoos. And people are self-censoring in a very large way, but also the positive things that are necessary for freedom, like so our welfare state, as you might have heard, is a little bit less well developed than yours in general, and such as it is, it's now being dismantled. And so if you're an older person and you're going to be denied Social Security and Medicaid, which is coming, you're also less free.
So can I just back up and ask you about this idea of negative freedom or freedom from? At the face of it, or on the face of it, it appears to be a great thing. Freedom from oppression, freedom from danger, freedom from tyranny, all seem like, positive things. What's the problem with negative freedom?
Yeah, the problem is that it's question begging, because freedom, and I agree with you, it sounds good, and of course it also is good. You don't want to be oppressed, you don't want to be subject to a tyrant. But the important part of the equation is the you part. So, to make it really simple, barbed wire isn't bad if there are no people around it. It's just barbed wire. A wall isn't bad if it's not holding people back, right? It's the essential thing is the person and not the barrier. And the problem with negative freedom is that it puts all of the emotional and moral and psychological attention onto the barrier. And so you think freedom is just a matter of liberating us from this bad thing. But if you think about freedom that way, you end up being caught in a moral trap. Because if freedom is just about liberating yourself from some bad thing, you've never really asked what the good thing is. You've never really asked what you are. You've never really asked what it means for you to be free. And then if you think the bad thing's gone away, so let's say you succeed in quote unquote liberating yourself, all those questions are still open, and then you look around for the next thing to oppose. And politically speaking, the way that it works, and you can see this, is that you oppose the government, you make the government weak, but not having answered the question of freedom positively, who am I, what do I care about, what do I value, what do I affirm, your next move is immediately to turn against your neighbors. Because your notion is that freedom means being against something. And once you're against one thing, your next move will be to be against something else. That's the problem with negative freedom, is that you get caught in this loop.
Mm-hmm. It was really striking to me, and certainly not surprising to people here in this audience, I'm sure, that this book that you've written begins with a vignette in Ukraine, where you're having a conversation with someone whose village is liberated, in the language that I might use as a reporter. But you use a word that is, in Ukrainian, deoccupied. Could you talk about what the word deoccupied does that the word liberation doesn't?
Yeah, thank you. That's very helpful. And thank you for referring to Ukraine, because it's a lot of I took this book on the road with me in various places, and I took it to various audiences, because the premise is, if you believe that freedom is positive, then the premise can't be, I know what freedom is on my own. It has to involve listening to other people. So I tried to listen to the people I was writing.
And you wrote a lot of it in Ukraine.
Yeah, I wrote a fair amount of it in Ukraine. I revised it in Ukraine quite significantly. And Ukrainians helped me to clarify some of the basic arguments, including this business of positive freedom. So I'm going to start somewhere else, and I'm going to land in Ukraine.
Okay.
The concentration camps are the classical example of where like a Canadian or an American or a British person would feel very comfortable using the word liberated. The concentration camps that we got to, we were very comfortable saying that we liberated those camps. And I want to say that even in that case, it's not appropriate, that it disguises something and it misleads something. And when I say that, I'm leaning into the primary sources left behind by doctors and nurses and other people who arrived after the 8th of May or the 9th of May, 1945, who pretty regularly said something along the lines of, liberation is not the word. And what they meant by that was, here you have these traumatized, sick people. And we can't just imagine that because we've lifted the evil, that we've solved the entire problem. And if you'll go along with me that far, like if you'll accept that if you accept that replacing the SS with British or American or Canadian or whatever soldiers is not liberation, then I think all the other examples then fall into place pretty easily. And so the word deoccupied from the Ukrainians is very helpful here because it suggests that negative freedom is a step towards positive freedom, but it's not the same thing. Mm-hmm. So you can remove the SS from a concentration camp, or you can remove the Russians from a Ukrainian village, and that's a very good thing, but there are a lot of other things that have to happen after that. So the Ukrainians say deokupacja, the noun deokupowane, as an adjective, and that I'm trying to bring that word into English, and there are a bunch of you here, so you can help. But I think deoccupy and deoccupied is a very helpful notion because it helpfully removes some of the glamour, some of the notion that it's just a matter of black and white, and reminds us that in the case where I begin the book, if there's a village where there's an old lady. She's now 86. She was 85 at the time I talked to her. No, she's 87 now. Maria's 87 now. But if there's an elderly person and her village has been quote unquote liberated, but she has a bit of a handicap and she uses a walker, and there's rubble between the aluminum shack, the corrugated metal shack she lives in, and the road, she's not free, right? From a great distance, maybe. And of course, it's good that she's no longer being bombed. But until the buses are running and she can get to the grocery store, until she can walk to the bus stop, she's not free.
But is that implicit in the word, or are you reading that into the word? I mean, because also you talk about, for example, villages or villagers who say, well, our place isn't free unless, as you say, the trains are running again.
I mean, there are probably like 150 Ukrainians out here who will then jump in Q&A. I'm now... See? Yaznav. But yes, it is implicit in the word.
Right.
It is implicit in the word, and that's why it's a helpful word. Yeah.
When you took on the job of defining the word freedom in this moment, you said that defining freedom, this task that you've taken on, is a different sort of ambition from defending it. Is there any sense in which it's actually a higher ambition in this moment that we're living in? Oh,
that's such a wonderful question. It really is, because I've come to the view that you can't defend it without defining it. So in my own little political or intellectual journey, on freedom it's the antipode to, or the answer to, on tyranny. And on tyranny, it's a little political pamphlet I wrote in late 2016, and it's very useful. I think for a lot of people, it's been very helpful. I mean, it's the book that's the bestseller in the United States right now. I mean, sadly, but I realized. So as I was like, I gave like 150 talks about on tyranny in the early days of the first Trump administration, trying to get people to understand that what was going on and how to behave. But a very reasonable question at that point was the question that you're asking. So if we're defending against tyranny, what is the thing that you're defending? And I think ultimately the answer is that you're not defending it, you're creating it. And if you're just defending it, then eventually you'll always lose, because if you're just defending in everyday organizational terms, you'll just be reacting. And if you're just defending, then you don't have a clear sense of what future you're aiming for. And so politically, that was what I was trying to answer. But then also intellectually, it's just much more interesting to try to figure out what freedom actually is. And when I started trying to answer it in 2017, I didn't have a sense of, I didn't know where I was going to go with it. And that's why it was so much fun for me, and so obsessively interesting. But I think it's philosophically necessary to do it from the ground up, and I also think it's politically necessary. I mean, I don't think we can do without a bigger notion of freedom. I don't think we can, like, the concepts that we use are things like democracy and institutions and rule of law, and that's all very important, but I think there has to be something which is bigger and more capacious and more human and more vibrant. than that.
So if you didn't actually have a landing place when you started the process, and it was a process, how close do you think you have actually gotten to the true meaning of freedom?
Well, of course, I've gotten it 100% correct.
Is there a moment, do you think, is there a moment that you can look back at and
Come on, you can't let me get away with that.
well, go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah.
So,
Are you happy with the definition that you've come up
okay,
with?
I'm very happy
Yeah.
with it. I'm very happy with it. But the point of it is that it's not like, so I wrote the book in vignettes, and I wrote it, I didn't write it as a series of propositions because I don't think you can actually define freedom that way deductively. I think the nature of freedom is that it's a little bit on this side, it's a little bit about the factual world, but it's also a little bit on the other side in the metaphysical world. Because freedom is about not just the way things are, but about the way things ought to be. And what makes us special is that we too live on both sides. We live where things are, but we also live in the way things might be, ought to be, should be. And freedom means being good at that. I mean, it means having various notions of how things might be better. And so you can't, like, I take a stab at various points in the book in characterizing freedom, but I don't think you can actually, like, define it because it's a state in which many good things are possible. It's a jumble. It's a bunch of combinations.
Values is what you
Yeah, the value
yeah.
of values. Thank you.
Yeah.
That's how I think about it.
Are you able to pinpoint a moment in the history of the US where you think that negative freedom became kind of the dominant aspiration of the political scene or of politics? Is there a moment that you can look back at?
Well, I mean, am I allowed to give two? Can I give-
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes.
Because I think it's important also to looking at the US today to understand the connection between negative freedom and the history of slavery. Because these are not like, these I enjoy having these arguments, but they're not, these arguments are also rooted in history. Like the reason why negative freedom is plausible, okay, this is another critique of negative freedom, but if you think the only problem is the government, what kind of life are you leading if the only problem for you is the government? If that's really the only problem, that means that you yourself are, a feudal landholder or a slaveholder, right? You yourself must have behind you serfs, slaves, women, right? You have a whole pyramid at which you're the top. If the central government is really the only problem for you. Now, I'm not saying like 150 million Americans believe that the central government is only but I mean if it's really the only problem for you. And in our history, that was the position, of course, of the plantation owners in the South, where they defined freedom as the ability to have slaves working their property. And that's negative freedom because the central government, the federal government, is the only instance that can take that away from you, right? And so one moment is the foundation of the United States. The second moment would be 1981, January 1981, the inauguration of Ronald Reagan as president. Because he very persuasively and charismatically and intelligently made the argument that government's never the solution, it's always the problem.
I'm from the government and I'm here to help.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, like that was supposed to be a joke, right? The scariest words in the English language, I think he said. And that was very persuasive. And it was also connected, by the way, to the history of slavery and the history of race, because the undertone of all of that was a phrase which Reagan probably didn't coin, but which he made popular, the idea of welfare cheats, welfare mothers, welfare queens, was the phrase that you may not hear that with your Canadian ears, but that means black women, and so the notion is that the welfare state. I'm sure like Canadian ears means you hear every American thing plus. So I promise not to do that again. But in the U.S. that would be obviously racially coded, and the notion is that you don't need the welfare state because you're white people and you're very hardy, and if you're sick or whatever, you're just going to get through it. But those black people, they will abuse the welfare state. They'll take everything. They'll take your tax dollars and then they'll just use them. right? And so the notion that the government can't help you is bound in even at that late date. And today, it's bound in with the idea that some people are hardy individuals and true, and other people are just going to abuse the government.
So that's on the domestic front. I'm curious, on the international front, the foreign policy front, when negative freedom became kind of the dominant aspiration in US foreign policy. There's the Soviet Union, there's the, as you call it, the adventure in Iraq. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, that's also a wonderful question. I mean, I think both 1989 and 2003 are very important. 1980, so there was a historical coincidence, which is that the Reagan era and the Thatcher era corresponded with the end of communism in Eastern Europe. And that coincidence led many people to believe that the end of communism discredited government action as such, or the social welfare state as such. Whereas the end of communism discredited the one-party state, it discredited central planning, perhaps. It discredited many things, but it didn't discredit all government action. And that's the way it got read, especially in the UK and in the US. Less so in Canada, interestingly, but in the UK and the US. And you see then from that point on, you see a pretty sharp divergence between American and Canadian policies, interestingly. And you guys start living longer, so, bless you from that point forward. Well, I'm not sure how to understand that laughter. It's like, is he gonna make it? Like, is he gonna make it through this whole discussion? Look at that frail person. And so 1989 was I think misunderstood in this way, and in an odd way, like it's kind of a Hegelian irony, but in an odd way, we took over historical determinism from Eastern Europe, from the Soviets, because we started saying, like, that's, many Americans, many people speaking English, we started to say, well, of course, the economy determines everything, but the economy is going to take care of democracy for us, right? And that means you don't need government. It means that government should just get out of the way, right? But of course, it also means that is actually very anti-democratic and anti-freedom, because if you think economics is going to take care of things for you, then you're not really a free person. 2003, the invasion of Iraq was an example of how far you can go with this notion, because there were many things wrong with, and I was against it at the time, by the way, and I was like in a minority. It was like one of the few times that I couldn't get my op-eds published was around the war in Iraq. But the people, there were many things wrong with it, but I'm just going to focus on this one thing. The people who made that war really did think that if you knocked over a government, then freedom and every capitalism and stuff would just kind of sprout up. And that is what, if you really believe in negative freedom, that's what you think. Like, you think the good things just kind of come along automatically. And so the notion that we were going to dismantle the army, dismantle the Ba'ath Party, make Iraq kind of start from the beginning, or to put it in a slightly more malicious mode, you're not harming a country by destroying everything, because if you destroy everything, then they can just start again. Right. And that's freedom.
Yeah. We'll get to the association of negative freedom with the left a little bit later, but why is it that negative freedom in the West is particularly associated with the political right?
Yeah, there's maybe want to ask about this, but part of it is that the left has ceded the ground. The left has ceded the ground. That the left doesn't talk about freedom, which I think is not enough, which I think is a terrible mistake. So the left has opened the ground to freedom.
Freedom writ large.
As the right has claimed the word, the left has, at least in my country and in the countries I know well in Europe, part of the problem is that the term has been granted to the right. But the second reason we've already talked about, which is the libertarianism to fascism transmission belt, where if you believe, like, you can believe that the government should be weak, but if you're saying the government should be weak, what you're really meaning is either oligarchs should be strong, or in the oligarchs, you might have noticed, are not particularly benevolent in general. I'm sure there's some nice ones out there. But at least, I'm sure they're nicer here, like everyone, but in
We're going to get into the oligarchs.
okay,
Yeah.
but the ones that really matter, at least in the United States, are fascists. I mean, the ones who matter right now. But there's the logic that we talked about earlier, which is that you make the government small, you create chaos, you create anger, and then you mobilize that in a certain direction. So those things.
You also connect negative freedom with a negative view of the human body.
Yeah.
Can you explain that?
Yeah. So a lot of the discussion that we have of freedom brackets all the things that are important. And this also bears on the right-wing question a little bit. Because when we start talking about freedom, at least in English, what we're usually doing is we're assuming, okay, there's already a rational person, and that person knows his interests. I'm using the pronoun advisedly. That person knows his interests. And so that person knowing his interests and being perfectly rational is looking out at the world. And so for freedom, all we need to do is make sure that person can pursue his interests. That is, in my view, completely logically bankrupt. It's historically bankrupt because it doesn't ask, how did you get to that ideal typical situation where that one person actually had that power? But it's philosophically bankrupt because it takes a huge amount of investment, collective investment, political, social, familial, amicable investment to create a person who's actually like that, right? And so, and the way that we do it has to do with the body. So if you're doing negative freedom, then it can all be very abstract. You don't have to think about the body. There's just a mind, right? There's just a mind. There's a disembodied mind. There's a mind in a jar. It's also a 50-year-old male, but it's a mind in a jar, and that mind in the jar, has interests, and it reacts rationally to the outside stimuli and so on, all that nonsense. But the truth is that you have to create, and once you know that you have to create, you ask how. Like, how do you get from the neurological to the moral, right? And how do you do that? And early childhood development has answers to these questions. We know that the first 5 months, the first 5 years are really important. The first 18 months even more important, and that children, and this is for me the most obvious bodily example, children need stimulation, they need attention, they need time, they need all kinds of physical attention, and that's relevant to freedom because in giving them those things, they're developing the capacities that they would need later on to make moral choices. And so that's the most basic way. And so basically, in my view, if books about freedom don't talk about childbirth, you don't have to read them, and that rules out almost all of them.
Okay. So let's just turn the page and talk about negative freedom from the left. And I want to take you as far back because you mention it in the book as Karl Marx. Could you talk about what you saw in terms of negative freedom in the thinking of Karl Marx? Okay.
So the way that I'm talking about positive freedom and negative freedom, I should stress, is my own. And I have to first rehearse a critique of positive freedom before I get to that question. Okay. So the most famous treatment of positive and negative freedom was an essay some 70 years ago by my teacher, the late Isaiah Berlin, in which he critiques positive freedom along the following lines. He says, positive freedom means a person becoming himself, but the problem with that is that somebody on the outside is going to be deciding what it means to become yourself. Whereas in my view of negative freedom, I'm not assuming that there's a single human nature. I'm assuming that we're all different and that the moral worlds that we would create or project outside of ourselves would all be very different. I'm not assuming that there's one good thing and that some kind of guidance, like a proletarian revolution, for example, would lead us to that one good thing. I'm assuming that there are a million good things. And so my account of positive freedom is different from the critique that Isaiah Berlin and others make of, for example, Marx. Their critique of Marx is that Marx is positive freedom and you can't allow that, that's dangerous, it gives authorities too much power, and therefore, you can draw the conclusion, only negative freedom is safe. Okay. Now, My view of Marx is different. My view of Marx is that it's not, in fact, positive freedom at all. I think positive freedom involves value pluralism, the notion that there are many good values. Marx does not. So I don't think Marx actually is an advocate of positive freedom. I think he's in fact an advocate of negative freedom because he takes the view that all we need to be free is the removal of one thing. Marx's view is that private property is essentially the original sin of modern human civilization, and that if you could get rid of that thing, then we would return to ourselves and all would be well. I think that's wrong. I mean, I think it's turned out not to be true empirically, but I also think it's conceptually wrong. I think all views that say all we have to do is get rid of some external factor X and we will be free are going to turn out to be wrong. Whether they're right-wing, left-wing, whatever. Like, for example, I don't think it's true that just getting rid of colonialism means that you're free. Getting rid of colonialism would be a very good thing, but if you then immediately found a new colonial state on a smaller scale, which is not unheard of in the history of post-colonialism, that's not freedom, right? And so the main kind of negative freedom we have to contend with is the American destroy the government kind. But in my case for freedom, I'm trying to point out that any view which says the problem's on the outside, there's just one problem, you have to eliminate it, that should arouse suspicion as an account of freedom.
So how does freedom from get articulated, if you fast forward well into today, in Putin's Russia?
Well, I think in the account of Russia, the problem with freedom from probably comes earlier. I don't think that accounts of freedom are at the center of what's going on now with Putin, but I think the way that Putin became possible and then was rationalized by us has a lot to do with negative freedom. So there are probably others who were in Eastern Europe in that turn of the 80s and 90s. It was an incredibly strong view then by the people who parachuted in speaking English that really all you needed to do was clear the landscape of privatize as quickly as possible, don't worry too much about the details, and things will take care of themselves. And that comes straight out of a negative freedom account of the world. The problem with that is that that was a particularly ill-suited approach to a centrally planned economy with a few valuable things, because it allows you to get to oligarchy very, very quickly, which is what happened in Russia and also in Ukraine, although they've diverged very much since then. And so many things, so central planning set that up. Central planning set up oligarchy because of the centralization, but the fact that the normative view was just have a Wild West and things will sort themselves out didn't help. And then as Putin, after the Yeltsin-Putin transition at the turn of the new century, after that transition, then we tended to look at Putin and say, well, he's just an economically rational person, and he's just trying to take care of things. And we didn't have any other paradigm for that. And so well after the fact that Putin became a tyrant with his own view of things, we were still saying, well, that's a technocrat, he's just kind of dealing with economic crisis.
You actually, when you look back, or when we look back, you anticipated Russia's invasion of Ukraine, both the 2014 version and then the 2022 version. I wonder if you could just talk about how you foresaw those events so confidently.
Well, first, to be fair, I did a much better job with 2014 than with 2022. So I'll answer the question with that.
Sure.
In 2014, it was the media. Somewhere around late November 2013, early December 2013, there was this shift in the Russian media where they were portraying the Ukrainians in these drastic ways, and incidentally contradictory ways. So like one day the Ukrainians were all gay, and the next day they were all Nazis, and the day after that they were all Jews, which is a view, by the way, which, that those elements are still present in Russian propaganda. They might seem contradictory, but they're all still present. And then there was a very specific thing that I wrote about at the time, early December 2014, which is that Putin had gone from, he'd said it before, and there are sources where I cite, but they're not that well known, but in pretty prominent ways, he was now talking about Russia and Ukraine being the same nation. And Russia and Ukraine being the same nation, I thought was unambiguously war talk, as it turned out to be, and as it always is, right? As it always is. So that's what, and I think I just was different from other people in that I was a little bit more like autistically focused on what was actually being said, as opposed to the overall, like the overall context was invasions don't happen anymore, and like all leaders are basically rational, and we're past all of that. Mm-hmm. And I was just focused on those primary sources. With 2022 was similar, but I didn't do as good a job in 2022.
But the way I understood it was that also that you were hyper-focused on what was being said in real life rather than what was also being said on social media and, you know, in the unreal world.
Yeah, it was a reading of the social media, like why are they doing these particular things in social media at this particular time? But you're right, it was also paying attention to what Putin had been saying over the years, because he took a turn around 2009, 2010 towards talking about Ukraine in a very different way, and I was trying to pay attention to that.
Better dead than red was a Cold War slogan on the American right. In 2025, there are T-shirts that actually say, "I'd rather be Russian than Democrat." I'm sure you remember, of course, in 2018, when Donald Trump indicated that he trusted Vladimir Putin more than the American intelligence sources, and in February, he called the Ukrainian president a, quote, dictator without elections. What accounts for this tectonic shift in attitude?
So I'm going to answer that, but first I'm just going to, I mean, in the defense of people who are on the far right, Russia is no longer a communist state. I mean, Russia is a fascist state. So if you're a fascist, it's going to be your thing. So I mean, I would critique fascists on many grounds, but I wouldn't say you're inconsistent for liking Russia. I think they're, you know, within their own framework, they are correct to like Russia, and Russia is correct to like them, and, you know, the feeling is mutual. So like so I understand the question, but I think the historical irony is not really there, because Russia really is, it's the fascism of the third decade of the 20th century. So naturally our fascists like Russia. There are other things going on like that. With the Trump people, it's the notion, which is Russian, like this is a success of Russian imperial propaganda, that Russia is real and Ukraine is not really real, and they have this kind of fetish for what they think of as strong men and strong countries, which has had the alarming consequence, and maybe we'll talk more about this, but it's had the alarming consequence of taking Russia and making it much stronger than it would have been otherwise. I mean, all of American foreign policy is now oriented towards making our enemies strong and our friends weak.
There's a whole other alliance that you talk about in your book that I found very striking, very different than what we're talking about here, and I found kind of surprising. You're talking about teaching classes in prison, and you're talking about one conversation where your students were talking about, you know, watching what's going on in Ukraine and feeling some common cause. The students felt that this, you know, this sort of connection with the Ukrainians as a people who are being colonized. I wonder what that tells you about the understanding of freedom on two very different landscapes. What does that tell you about the moment that we're in today?
Okay, that's an interesting one. I mean, just to take a step back, the reason why I was in prison was methodologically the same as the reason why I was in Ukraine. That is to say, I wanted to listen to people who talk about freedom, but whose entrance into the discussion was very different than my own. And in the United States, and we've already brushed on this subject a couple of times, but in the United States, the way that we talk about freedom has everything to do with race. And so the notion, so African Americans speaking about liberation often have a much broader notion or a more historical notion than other people might do. So I was particularly concerned, like I was concerned about my own positionality in all of this, because after the thing in Ukraine, I start the book with a scene in a farmhouse, which is like a very like where my family is from, and it's meant to be a very American scene. Although I also try to build into it the things that were wrong with the scene and were wrong with my childhood as well as what was right. But the things that are wrong about my childhood is that very early on, in the United States, if you're white, you lose the ability to see certain things and empathize with other things, and you see the history of your country in ways that pushes other people out and which closes doors. And so I was trying to make sure, like as best as I could, that I was in an epistemic situation where I would be confronted by people whose standpoints were very different than my own. And prison was terrific for that. I mean, prison is really good as a place to teach for a lot of reasons, but one is that they have a lot of time to do the reading, and they do the reading. It's really. No, if you're a professor, like when they do the reading, like it's just incredibly charming. They do the reading, and they had a lot of time to talk about it, and they were really well prepared for seminar. I mean, it was the best seminar that I've ever taught. But the other, I mean, you're okay. But the other thing about it is that they, like in the U.S., where we imprison such a big percentage of our population, we have a huge amount of talent that's incarcerated. And so the class that I was teaching was an incredibly competitive class. It's very, very hard to get into this program. Like it's harder than getting into an elite university. And so the guys who were in the class were actually very gifted. So they were coming from a different place. They were in prison. They were looking at me, from their point of view, they're looking at me as rich, privileged white guy. And so so they helped me to find a language which would be rich, right? And so positive freedom for them, like it has to mean creating the conditions which would have been very different from the conditions of their childhoods. Creating conditions where things wouldn't have been so rough on their parents. And so the connection between that and Ukraine is that I'm looking for a different standpoint. But another obvious connection goes back to your very first question or early questions. Like, what is the full meaning of liberation? Like, what does it mean to be liberated? It's not just having the Russians out of your village. It's also not just leaving prison. It's having some place to go after you're in prison where a rich life might be possible. Or it's the conditions that would have made it much less likely that you or people from where you're from would have ended up in prison in the first place. But I mean, actually the thing they focused on is like, who is the colonizer and who's the colonized? Like that's what they wanted to know. And at the beginning, I mean, to get this right, they assumed that the Americans were the colonizers, because that's where they start from. I mean, understandably, frankly. But they assumed that in the Russian-Ukrainian war, the Americans were the colonizers, and so therefore the Ukrainians must be the bad guys. And we worked on that, and we read on that. It was like actually they were kind of in a weird way they were sort of my support group, because the prison teaching started right when the invasion of Ukraine started, and they wanted to know about it. And some of them had been in the U.S. military, and they wanted to know what was going on in this war. And so I ended up like doing a lot of chalkboard work about the war, and they wanted to know about like how my friends were doing, and like, they wanted to know these things, and so there was a human way in which they were able to identify with the people who were being attacked.
Well, the end result is empathy.
Yeah. I mean that's so beautiful. That's so true. Like they ended up empathizing with the Ukrainians, which I found incredibly touching, because it's not just many miles, but there's so much difference between their position and the Ukrainian position. And they ended up empathizing with the Ukrainians. And some of them ended up writing about Ukrainian history. Like some of them ended up writing about the Ukrainian famine. They empathized. And then it was a very touching moment later on, because some of these students in prison became characters in the book because their interventions in the argument were important. And so then I was taking that book to Ukraine and having Ukrainian philosophers and so on read it.
The other interesting thing, just to stay on this for a moment, that I found fascinating was the testimony of one of these men upon being released after decades of being in prison, talking about that he's never seen more unfree people in his life. But he was actually referring to the little screens we're all looking at all day.
Yeah. So, I mean, as you all know, people serve really long terms. In the U.S., we have more people, we have about as many, maybe more, we have about as many people serving life sentences now as we had in prison in 1970. We have a lot of lifers, and we have a lot of people serving really long sentences, just catastrophically long sentences. And but then it does give you, yeah, I mean, a guy that I taught, or a guy that I knew, came out after 38 years, was it? And so he missed not just, social media, but he missed the internet. And so it was like time travel for him, because of course they're not really allowed to have much screen time in prison. And he came out and he looked at the way we behave, and that's what he said. And it's really striking how right he is, I've got to say. I mean, like,
But you seem to agree with him.
I do agree with him. I mean, first of all, we are less free, and so we have to ask the question, right? Like, are we less free because of social media? I think the answer is yes. But we're more directly less free to social media, right? Like, our impulses, our habits, our addictions, our way of living life has been drawn towards this box. And the thing that his view helps with is that we kind of all did this together, right? So we've all become, the I don't know, I mean, we've all become these fleshy algorithms together.
Right.
And because we've done it together, we haven't really noticed it. But if somebody drops in from outer space and looks around, and they could say, like, what are you people doing? Like, there's a beautiful breeze blowing outside. And that was his perspective, yeah.
But
and then,
even,
of course, and the other thing which happens, of course, is that guys come out of prison and they immediately get addicted, right, to it.
Yeah. But even though we all did this together, I am particularly curious what your thoughts were as we watched Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, and Mark Zuckerberg sitting there at the presidential inauguration. I'm just wondering what went through you.
Well, I mean, I've been working for a while with the categories of digital oligarchs and hydrocarbon oligarchs, and the hydrocarbon technology is one that allowed us to think we were in charge in the 19th and 20th centuries, and now it's a technology which is making it seem like we're not going to be in charge. I have in mind global warming, of course. And digital technology likewise had the promise in the late 20th century that we were going to have more control, more power. And in fact, it's now becoming the opposite, where we seem to be controlled by the algorithms to a very large degree. And the people, unfortunately, I mean, some of them, they're different, they have different ideas, but some of them clearly have the notion that this is a very fine thing because humans weren't really destined to do very much in the first place. And there are a few of them who are kind of a higher caste who are going to bring us into something different and new and post-human. And these are fascist ideas, of course. These are fundamentally fascist ideas. The people who think that humans should be spending all their time online very often are people who think, but I'm going to lead you, with my digital power into some kind of new tribe, new future on this planet or some other planet. So what did I think? I mean, what I think is that the companies have to be broken up. What I think is that it's basically accidental that these people have so much money. What I think is that you can't have democracy unless you have local news. You can't have democracy unless you have 10,000, like. Yeah, I'm glad to hear you clapping, because that's one of the most predictable things. I mean, in the loss of democracy, the loss of local news is one of the most predictable signs of where things are going. So if you were a Canadian government or provincial government or a government of a city in Canada, you want to make sure that you're treating news, especially local news, like a public good. Because if you don't treat it like a public good and it goes away, then the space gets filled up by the social media, and democracy becomes much, much harder. So that's what I thought. I thought, okay, we needed to be taking a turn away from all this, but no, look, here we are.
I'm very cognizant we have 10 minutes left before we have to go to questions, so I'm going to try to cram a few more questions in here. But you use a particular term, Sadopopulism, combining sadism with populism. Where do you see that at work exactly?
Yeah, so a lot of people are very critical of populism. I don't know exactly what it means in Canadian English, but I don't think populism is really the problem. I mean, populism is people promising stuff to other people that maybe they can't deliver, and okay, that's bad, but it seems like it's not nearly as bad as other things, like, I don't know, like totalitarianism or fascism or the destruction of your own government or invading other countries. But populism at least has, populism may be mendacious, it may be demagogic, but at least contains within it like the promise of I'm going to do something for the people. Whereas what I mean by Sadopopulism is something else, that I'm going to say the government doesn't really work, but I can make sure that, and everybody's going to hurt, which you might have noticed is something that Mr. Trump is saying a lot now. Everybody's going to hurt, but I can make sure that some people hurt more than others. And so rather than promising that everybody's going to do a little bit better, what I can do is I can say, you guys get to watch. You're going to hurt, but it's going to be okay because you get to watch as these guys get hurt much, much more.
And you say that this normalizes oligarchy, Sadopopulism.
Yeah, I mean, it's normalizes oligarchy for sure. Well, if you think that, I mean, if politics shifts into a system where the people on top just their charge, their responsibility is the dispensation of pain, then that's a natural fit for oligarchy. But it's also a natural fit for fascism, because I'm turning you against you. I mean, you're special insofar as you hurt less, and you get to watch them hurt more. So, like terror deportations are an example of Sadopopulism, like where you're supposed to enjoy that. It's not making anybody better off in any normal, enlightened sense, but you're supposed to enjoy the idea that some people are going to be deported to a Salvadoran gulag.
Mm-hmm. I want to talk about dissidents for a moment, because you spend some time talking about them. You've spoken and written about several, Václav Havel, who didn't like the term dissident, as well as a number of figures in Eastern Europe, poets, thinkers, and Ukrainian President Zelensky himself. What do you believe is the most effective form of dissidence right now?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that the dissidents were very good, I think, at conceptualizing what was actually going on around them. And that's why there weren't that many of them, and that's why it was easy to characterize them as eccentric, as oddballs, as not in touch, which is what happened to them. But what they were very good, Havel's a good example, they were very good at conceptualizing what was actually happening. And I do think that is very important. So it's hard to resist, in the US at least, because so much of our reporting, or what passes for reporting, is just stenography. So you accept the concepts, right? So for example, the notion that the Trump administration is punishing American universities for their anti-Semitism, that is absurd, okay? That is not what is happening. The people who are in charge of the American government are, I hope this is not a big bulletin, but they are not friends of the Jews. And they in a very obvious way. And what they are doing is that they are they're saying, okay, we're going to punish universities. Think of a historical example where the people who went after universities did it on behalf of the Jews. Okay, that does not happen. Columbia was 23% Jewish. Taking the federal funding away from Columbia is not the thing you would do if you were a friend of the Jews. Deporting Muslims without trial is also not a thing you would do if you're a friend of the Jews, right? Because it's a provocation. And pretending that it's all about anti-Semitism is feeding the notion that the Jews are actually in charge of everything, right? Also anti-Semitic. So in this, the things I'm saying, that's like politics 101. That should be obvious. These guys, the American federal government has a policy of fomenting anti-Semitism, but they say it's combating, and because they say it's combating, then our reporters feel like they have to frame it in terms of that, right? But we have to. One thing dissidents are very good at is that conceptual work, like Klemperer in the 30s, Havel in the 80s and the 70s, but then opposition has to go beyond dissidence. Like dissidence, for me at least, is about clarifying the concepts, setting an example. Like making sure people don't normalize, like giving them the words, the examples so they don't normalize. But then opposition has to involve organization, everyday activity, friends, palpable goals, things doing things together, being in a good mood, right? So dissidence is important, but not everybody has to be a dissident. You just need a few of them, and then you can have opposition.
Of the ones you've met and written about, is there one that has had a lasting impact on you?
Oh, many of them. I mean, many of them. But for me, like the idea that so I was partly educated in Eastern Europe, and one of my doctoral supervisors was an East European who was both a Holocaust survivor and someone who was put in a camp under communism. And that notion that being faithful to, so this is why Havel didn't like the word dissident, because what Havel said is, if you want to be a good anything, engineer, school teacher, his example was actually brewer of beer. If you read Power the Powerless, that's his example. If you want to be a good brewer of beer, that means you have values, right? You care about the quality, you care about doing things right. And if you care about doing things right, you're always going to run up against a system which is cynical, technocratic, about consolidating power and so on. And so that, like that notion that the thing that you care about, like for example being a historian, is going to make you run up against things. But that happened to my advisor. That happened to many people in Poland where I did my doctoral work. And so that I take as normal. Just sociologically, I think that's how you behave.
Last two questions before we go to audience questions. One is, you're still associated with Yale University, but you are one of 3 Yale professors who are currently at the University of Toronto. And I'm curious whether you would describe that decision to come here as an act of freedom from or freedom to.
Well, I mean, the funny thing is, like, you could ask all 3 of us and you get 3 different answers.
One of them being Marcy, who's your wife.
Well,
Yeah.
so I was going to sound off about this. The whole idea, like anybody who's been in a marriage, like the whole idea that you and your wife have to have a common position on the things that you do.
Tell us more.
I just want to undermine that. Like, that's ridiculous. I don't like, see, the actual married couples in the front row are like, yeah. They're like, preach. No, but I like this whole this whole media idea that like your wife, like you walk in front of the cameras and your wife holds your hands and like you say something and she nods. Like, that's ridiculous. I really don't like that. Like couples, like things that couples do happen because there happens to be an overlap, you know?
So I'm really hoping to interview Marcy actually separately, but I'd like to know your view.
Okay.
Is it a freedom from or a freedom to?
It's so, I mean, in all seriousness then, I mean, I would really, really not want to. So it turns like I'm leaving Yale for the University of Toronto. And Yale is a wonderful, wonderful university which allows its undergraduates to flourish. And it's a terrific place. I mean, you don't have to send your kids to America, I get it. But so I wouldn't want to say like leaving Yale is somehow, Yale does an extraordinary job of the things that it does. And I'm leaving for another university which does similar things on a much bigger scale in a different way. It's a big public university. And I think, there's a way in which I can be more free here, which has to do with, the sort of overall structure, which is that American universities are facing an attempt to destroy them, essentially. Like the policy of the US federal government now it's not about anti-Semitism. It's about destroying universities. It's about destroying the concept of the humanities. It's about turning people into drones. It's about ending social mobility as such. So in that sense, like there's work up here that I can do, I'll be more free to do. But that wasn't I gotta say that wasn't really the reason why I came. The reasons why I came had to do with like, change in life and family and attractions to the University of Toronto. Yeah. But I'm going to resist the notion that things that I do are necessarily of like philosophical, let alone world historical quality.
Here's maybe a more direct question. I'm curious whether, given all that's happened in the US, let's say in the last 75 or 80 days, do you still feel at home in the US?
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
Of course I feel at home in the US. Of course. And I would assume that no matter how bad things got in Canada, you would feel at home in Canada. But it's, I mean, at the end of On Tyranny, I try to make a distinction between patriotism and nationalism, and they're as different ways of loving, right? Like, so if you love your country regardless of what it does, and you feel compelled to love everything the government does, you're a nationalist. But if you love your country because you want it to live up to its values, then you're a patriot, I think. So I think of myself as a patriot. So I feel all of these things in terms of what I understand to be violations of our best selves, or violations or eliminations of future American futures that might have been, and that touches me very deeply as an American. So I don't feel alienated from the United States. I feel sad for Americans who are being hurt, and for people who are in America who are being hurt. And I feel very worried that the trajectory of our present government involves a self-destructiveness, and I mean, in the end, a destructiveness of the United States. I'm very concerned that the people who run my country don't care at all about its people or its interests, and I care about that in a special way because I am American.
Last question on empathy. In the book On Freedom, you write about empathy not as an emotional act, but as a kind of political principle. And you go further and you say, empathy is the only way to become a reasonable person.
Yeah,
Can you explain to us how?
I think so.
Yeah.
So again, it goes, if I can just circle back to the discussion about positive and negative freedom. In negative freedom, if I think it's just a matter of liberating myself from this outside problem or breaking through this barrier, then we're assuming that like everything is fine with me. There's just the barrier. There's just the problem. But I'm free except for that external thing. I know who I am, I know what I want, I know what my values are, but I probably don't. And I may need to break that barrier, but breaking the barrier isn't going to answer those questions for me. That image of that lonely person who's already free and already knows everything about himself or herself is deeply rooted in the word and in my culture, and it's incorrect. You cannot know, you can't be reasonable without the help of other people. And like if we go back to childbirth, that becomes obvious. You can't raise human beings to be reasonable by leaving them alone, right? We need a huge amount of attention to have any chance of having a child turn out to be reasonable. It doesn't happen on its own. And that is actually true for all of us all of the time. We make huge mistakes about ourselves all of the time. All the time, yeah. Yes, thank you. There's like, I just want to note there's only one person nodding, which is a bad sign when I'm like doing this riff about self-awareness. So the only way to know yourself is to be able to listen to other people. And you can't listen to other people unless you actually believe that they are other people, which is easy to say, but hard to do. So empathy, like I borrow from a German philosopher called Edith Stein on this, but empathy has to do, going back to your earlier question, has to do with the body. It has to understanding that this person was also born, they're also going to die, they're also frail, they could also be weak, they could also be sick. They're in space in a way that's similar to the way I'm in space, right? So actually accepting that, which is pretty hard. Like try it, with your friends on the way home. It's pretty hard. But if you can do it, that means you might actually learn about yourself. Because just like you can't see your own back, there are things that you can't see about the way you are in the world, and those things that you can't see are often the things that make you less free. Or they're the things that make you vulnerable to other people's lies. And you need help in that situation. So empathy is not, it's not a kind of bonus that's on the side to freedom. It's a prerequisite to being a free person.
Can it be something that's more than aspirational? Do you have any hope that that is actually, that can become the norm?
I really do, and it goes. I mean, you gave the lovely example of the Ukrainians. I mean, the Ukrainians receiving empathy from people in this very, very different position far away. Yes, I very much do. I very much do. We are capable of this. This whole programming that we've had, that we are meant to be isolated, atomized individuals locked away in our cars or locked away staring at screens, that's programming. Like, we're capable of being that way. But we're also capable of being other ways. We are very capable, most of us, of learning to be empathetic. And I just want to just land on this point that it's not something that goes beyond us. It's something that we really are capable of and actually have to be trained out of. And the negative, I mean, one of the things which the negative freedom idea does is that it presents itself as being natural. Like, it says it's natural that you're alone, that you have your own interests, right? But there's nothing natural about that. I mean, it's actually more natural to say we're all born, we're all going to die. In some sense, we're in this together, and if we want to be free at all, we're going to have to try to understand one another. And I know it's possible because I've seen it. I know it's possible because I've seen it, and I've seen it work politically as well. So,
thank you so much for taking my questions.
No, thank you.
Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
What a pleasure. Thanks very much.
Thanks.